some of the predictions coming from IMF suggesting the world economy is likely to further slow down and possibly even signs of a crisis. Mr. Mauro, what is your expectation?
Well, my expectation is that we shouldn't be overly pessimistic. If you look at the forecast for this year, we have 3% for global growth, and for next year we have 3.5%. These are still relatively healthy growth rates. If you put it in perspective, it means that world output is going to double within the next 20 or 25 years. So yes, there is a little bit of a slowdown, but in the grand scheme of things, the world economy is growing. Things are okay in the United States. Things are picking up in Europe. There's discussion of a slowdown in emerging markets. We have to see. I would say the question mark is still out there for whether there is a slowdown in China or not. We certainly have a recession right now in Brazil and in Russia. India is looking good. It's still growing very fast. So I think it's a bit of a mixed picture. And, you know, this does have implications for policies that we can discuss later.
Are you, Mr. Gros, as optimistic to a certain degree as Mr. Paolo from the Washington, D.C.?
Europe certainly doesn't look that strong, but it's rather a slowdown, a mild slowdown in Europe. I think we are miles away from the crisis in real terms and the crisis atmosphere which we had in 2008. So I would say the leaders shouldn't really get too much upset about this slowdown in economic growth. They should concentrate more on the longer term fundamentals.
China. Chinese President Xi Jinping argued China still contributes to 1/3 of the world's economic growth, even in the year 2015 after the growth rate comes down. Mr. Xi, what should be China's role and what can be China's role?
Well, among G20 countries, China is going to be the second fast growth economy next year. I mean, I think that's very tremendous. But there will be short-term goals and long-term goals. I think short-term is about stabilization of economic growth, but the long-term, we need to have sustainable growth, which really means financial sector reform, dealing with overcapacity, which also means other countries, they should not expect too much from China.
We were discussing this earlier in some other editions of program, and we were talking about one important factor, whether the promises made by governments, whether it's China or the United States or others, will be delivered. That's probably the most important thing. For China, of course, it's the reform agenda, as you just mentioned. How much do you think that could be implemented? I'm not asking you to be, a fortune teller, but rather looking at the realities, particularly with the fact some of those points mentioned in the 13th five-year plan were also mentioned in previous plans and did not necessarily implemented. So how much really?
I think the essence of 13th five-year plan is about inclusive growth model. It seems to me that means greater emphasis on consumption and less emphasis on investment, which requires much faster pace of financial liberalization. I'm not a fortune teller, but there will be certain goalposts. So for example, to remove restrictions on outbound investment and to create certain link between Chinese Stock Exchange and Hong Kong, London. And for example, to pack RMB to a basket of currencies, not packing against US dollar, pretty much as it is now. So, I mean, those are very important goalposts.
Mr. Gros, we see quite a number of shuttling diplomacy between the Chinese capital and the European capitals over the past few months among the leaders between these two places. People are talking about with common consensus, there is a possibility of revive the economy on both sides. How much hope do you put on the China's reform agenda? What does it mean in terms of momentum for the European economies, though?
Oh, I think actually the two are perhaps to some extent competitors, because both the euro area and China have a very large external current account and trade surplus. So both, in a certain sense, are subtracting growth from the rest of the world. And this is something you should keep in mind when your leader says that 30% of growth comes from China. Mathematically, that's correct. But this year, probably China will actually subtract demand from the rest of the world because its imports are falling faster than its exports. That was completely different in 2008, when China was really a strong powerhouse for the world economy, because in that period, 2008, its imports increased much faster than exports. So we have to look at the quality of Chinese growth and how its external surplus is increasing. Europe, or rather the euro area and China, have been coordinating because both have this similar problem. Both are living from demand from the rest of the world, and they want to avoid criticism from the Americans and others. And that's why there has been this active diplomacy between the two. But fundamentally, I think there's very little China can do to help European growth. Europe has to do its homework first, do its structural reform before there can be any hope of a more dynamic European economy.
Mr. Xi, you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think that is why it's so important to have this dialogue, because if China will do what China did in 2008, that would seriously compromise China's sustainable growth. Therefore,
the quality of growth.
Exactly. So China must avoid large fiscal stimulus package. Of course, many other countries, they want to sell more commodities to China. But I think those countries should understand, in the long run, successful reform of China may imply short-term pain, meaning reduced demand for commodities.
Right. Mr. Mauro, of course, the set of questions for Washington could be a little bit different from that of Beijing. But for example, about the Fed interest rates, about the U.S. attitude, and also way of doing things, how it's impacting the growth potential of the other economies. Your thought here?
Well, I think I agree with some of the things that were said earlier, and one that I would like to pick up on is the fact that there is clearly a rebalancing of the demand from China. We see a move away from a lot of investment, we see a move away from a lot of exports, and a move toward more consumption, and that's certainly something that can be accompanied through reforms. So, for example, if there's reform of the health system, people will feel more secure, and therefore that will lead them to spend more. But in terms of what one might expect from the global economy, I would say that we're likely to see continued very accommodative monetary policies, both in the United States and in Europe.
What do you mean by accommodating, by the way? What is accommodating from the U.S.
Well,
way?
very low interest rates for a very long time. So, for example, now we hear a discussion of whether the Fed should raise by 25 basis points or not in the next few months. But the Fed has made it very clear all along that if it does raise interest rates, it's going to do so very, very gradually, and it will take years before interest rates return to anything like the levels that we saw in the past. So in that sense, in the United States, I expect continued very loose monetary policy, and certainly in Europe, it's very likely that the quantitative easing program will be continued, if not expanded further. Now, when it comes to fiscal measures, I think countries have less space because the debts have gone up so much during the crisis that we're not likely to see fiscal expansion anymore.
I see. On the other hand, Mr. Mauro, people are wondering whether the developed economies could play a more active role in terms of the promises they've already made when it comes to international governance or global governance reform, such as with IMF letting emerging economies play any more role, China included. How fast do you think developed economies could deliver that? To what extent do you think those actions and inactions would influence the overall picture of reform in China and therefore the overall global economy? including other emerging economies, of course?
Well, I would say there's a distinction between the very specific issue of the quota reforms in the International Monetary Fund and the broader issue of international economic governance. I would say that as far as the IMF reform is concerned, everybody agrees that that reform should be implemented, and the one stumbling block at this time is the United States Congress. Certainly the United States administration is favorable to that reform, and it's the Congress at this time that needs to be persuaded, and that's proving to be very difficult. But if it comes to more general international economic governance, I would say that the role of the advanced economies is to be open to the new initiatives that are coming out from some of the emerging markets. Just to take one example, the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was initiated by China but has now attracted 57 members, that potentially can be very helpful. And I would say the role of the advanced economies is to ensure that that potential is really for everybody's benefit.
Right.
So we really want more infrastructure in the emerging markets. We want the right kind of infrastructure, something that is going to help us with respect to climate change, for example.
All right, and of course we need to note here, United States has not participated in any discussion yet about the AIIB, Mr. Mauro. But before we go, I want to go back to you, Mr. Gros. What about the changing of international economic governance? How much is it really going to give us a momentum and a push about the current stages or stalemate of our economic development? What is your take?
There's very little that can really be done because most nations want to retain their choices. So in Europe, they want to continue with a prudent fiscal policy, and therefore, even if growth is slow and there's a large external current account surplus, the euro area says, okay, that's your problem, not ours, we cannot do more. And everybody more or less does the same thing. But I think in terms of the international fora, the IMF reform is really important. It's symbolic perhaps, it's specific,
Right.
but as long as the United States, which is at the center of this system, cannot agree with the reform, then there's very little that can be done. And it's no use for the United States administration, for the president to say, I would like to do it, but unfortunately Congress doesn't allow me, because the United States is a system, a democratic system, where in the end decision-making relies with the Congress, and we have to get the American people on this track. And as long as there's this blockage, I think many things that should be done cannot be done.